Do you know that shading with only one pencil could silently hold back your realism skills without even realizing it? Or there's a simple trick that you are probably overlooking that could transform your art from flat to realistic in no time? Well, these two are nothing compared to the five things I wish I knew before I started realism, so that you could learn from my struggles and fast track your art in 2025. With that said, let's get on with them.
Now, let's take this image on my left, for example. The details in the eye, skin, and hair are hard to see because of the blur. And if you can see the details, you can't draw them. This forces you to guess where the shadows, highlights, and textures should be, leading to inaccurate proportions and unrealistic features. Now, compare that to the clearer version on my right. You can see the crisp details in the eyelashes, skin pores, and lighting. A high quality reference removes the guesswork, letting you capture realistic textures, shadows, and depth more accurately. Okay, so with all these in mind, what are the mistakes that we could avoid to improve our realism? Firstly, please stop using blurry or dark photos. If you can't see the details, you can't draw them. Secondly, avoid filtered images. Filters remove natural shadows and textures. Thirdly, don't use social media pictures with poor lighting. Bad lighting distorts proportions and values. So, why does all this matter? Right? A clear, well lit reference makes your work so much easier. You will be able to see subtle variations in skin texture, place shadows, and highlights correctly, and keep proportions accurate. This small change will take your art from flat to realistic. You will see subtle variations in skin texture, making portraits more lifelike. Shadows and highlights will be placed correctly, improving depth. And lastly, your proportions will be more accurate because you can clearly see the reference.
Okay, you are going to love thing number two. If you ever struggle in getting your drawing to look proportionally correct.
Thing number two, don't run away from using grids or other proportion methods. At first, I thought that using grids means that you were cheating. I always told myself that real artists freehand everything, right? So I avoided them and drew portraits completely by eye. But every time, something felt off. One eye too big, a jawline too wide. I'd spend hours trying to fix it, only to realize the whole drawing was just slightly wrong. No matter how much I refined the details, the proportions were always just slightly incorrect. And here is the thing, no amount of shading can fix bad structure. That's when I finally gave grades a chance. Trust me, I was really skeptical about using grades, but I just had to try. So one day, I watched a YouTube video that completely changed my mindset. The artist explained that grades aren't just about getting proportions right. They actually train your eye to see shapes and distances more accurately. Surprising, right? Because I would have thought the total different. That freehand would do the total, grade will be the total opposite of freehand. I decided to test it for myself and I was shocked at the difference. Not only did my portraits look better, but I also noticed something else. My overall drawing speed improved because I wasn't constantly erasing and redrawing. I saved so much time. And over time, even when I did freehand, my accuracy was way better than before. Now, just using grid isn't enough. You need to equip yourself with the mentality of using it correctly. So, here are some mistakes to avoid. Number one, stop thinking that grades are a crutch. What do I mean by that? You need to get out from the mentality that grades lowers your skills when it comes to realism. On the contrary, grades actually train your eyes to recognize proportions better over time. Number two, you need to stop skipping proportions and jumping straight into details. Please, I know that it is really tempting, but you need to stop doing that, especially when it comes to realism. If the structure is off, right, no amount of shading will fix it. And I know that some of us really have that idea that, oh, I can shade later and that will, yes, it will not fix it. So please stop doing that. Okay, so with all these in mind, why do grades matter? Well, grades and measurement techniques don't just help with accuracy, they actually save you time and frustration. Instead of constantly erasing and redrawing, you start with the right structure. That means you can focus on making the shading and details look realistic. So, therefore, with grids, your features are correctly placed, avoiding distorted faces. You will spend less time fixing mistakes and more time refining shading. And your final drawing will look polished and professional.
Now, before I get into the next three things, which you are going to love if you are serious about improving your art, please hit that subscribe button for more drawing tips. I upload videos every week, right, on how you can improve your craft in 2025. And you won't want to miss them. With that said, let's get on to thing number three.
When I first started drawing, I outlined everything: eyes, lips, even shadows, because I thought that's how you defined shapes. But in real life, objects don't have black outlines. So, what actually defines them? Light and shadows. I used to think outlining was the best way to define features. When I first started with realism, shading was a real challenge for me, and that's completely normal for beginners. Since I struggled to define features through shading, I relied on outlines as a shortcut. But here's the funny thing: I kept wondering why my drawings didn't look realistic. Yet I had no idea that thick outlines were actually the problem. Instead of adding depth, they flattened my drawings, making them look more cartoonish than lifelike. To avoid the mistakes that I made, here's what you should stop doing if you want your drawings to look more realistic. Number one, stop drawing thick outlines around features. This flattens the drawing and makes it look cartoonish. Number two, stop ignoring soft edges. Not everything has a sharp separation. Many areas blend softly. And number three, stop shading without considering light direction, which is mostly common among beginners. If you don't understand how light works, your drawing won't look three-dimensional. The key to realism isn't lines, it's values. Once I stopped thinking in terms of outlines and started focus on light and shadow, my drawings became so much more realistic. So, how do focusing on light and shadow improves realism? Well, faces look more lifelike because shadows create form instead of outlines. Also, hair looks soft and natural instead of looking like separate strands. And lastly, light and shadow create depth, making objects pop off the page.
Tip number four is a game changer. If you ever felt like your drawings just aren't improving fast enough,
Okay, so I used to get frustrated when my drawing didn't look perfect within the first hour. I'd rush through shading, try to fix things too quickly, and somehow I just make it worse. What I didn't realize back then was that realism isn't about speed, it's about layers, and learning that changed everything. Now, please don't make the same mistakes I did, right? If you want to improve your realism, you gotta do this. Firstly, stop trying to get instant results. Realism takes time, there is no shortcut. So what you've been saying on YouTube about, let's say, famous artists start from something and then immediately turn out to be a whole beautiful project work, please don't do it, right? Don't fall for it. I imagine it took them huge amount of time and huge amount of patience to bring out that realistic work that they are showing off. So please do the same. Do not rush it. Secondly, please stop jumping into details too early. I know this is a really common mistake among beginners, including me. If your foundation, right, proportions and shading is off, details won't save the drawing. And eventually, you would recognize that and would have to start all over. So please, refrain from jumping straight into details. And thirdly, stop skipping breaks. When you stare at your drawing for too long, your brain starts to adapt to what it sees, making it harder to notice mistakes. You might not realize that a nose is slightly misaligned or that the shading is patchy because your eyes have gotten used to it. Taking short breaks, right, just a few minutes away from your work, helps you reset your perspective. When you come back with fresh eyes, mistakes that were invisible before suddenly stands out, making it easier to fix them before they become a bigger issue. This simple habit can drastically improve your accuracy and prevent frustration from setting in later. So, once I accepted that realism takes time, I started working smarter, not just harder. Instead of rushing, right, I built shading gradually, fixed mistakes early, and let the drawing develop naturally. So, with all these in mind, how can patience, right, make a difference when it comes to realism? Firstly, it provides smoother shading because you are blending in layers instead of rushing. Secondly, it provides more refined details because you are not scrambling to finish. And lastly, you are able to do more accurate proportions, right? Because you are checking your work instead of just moving forward. So, If you've ever felt frustrated that your drawings don't look realistic fast enough, just remember realism takes time.
Finally, the last tip is the foundation of everything. Now, if you don't get this right, your drawing will always look off.
So, for the longest time, right, I didn't realize I was making a huge mistake in my drawings. I was drawing what I thought an eye or nose, right, looked like, rather than what was actually in front of me. No matter how hard I tried, my portraits never looked quite right. But once I started truly looking at my reference, instead of relying on what I thought things should look like, my drawings improved almost instantly. Instead of forcing an eye to fit a simple almond shape or drawing lips as just two curved lines, I began noticing the real details: how the eyelid folds, how light reflects in the eyes, and how shadows gradually blend into the skin. The more I focused on what was actually there, the more natural and realistic my drawings became. So, how does drawing what you see rather than what you think you see improves your skills in realism? Firstly, your portraits will actually resemble the reference instead of looking generic. Before, my drawings would look like random faces instead of the person I was trying to capture. But once I started observing my reference carefully, and that takes time and determination, the unique features like the exact shape of the nose, the subtle tilt of the eyes, and the specific curves of the lips became much clearer. This made my portraits look more like real people rather than just a standard face. Now, secondly, if you learn how to draw exactly what you see from your reference, the shadows and highlights, right, will be placed correctly, making your subject look three-dimensional. Now, when I stopped guessing and started paying attention to light, right, I noticed that shadows weren't just random dark spots. That took me time. They actually defined the shape of the face. Highlights weren't just bright areas, they showed where the light hit naturally. Once again, that took a while for me to determine the difference between the shadows and the highlights. Now, by focusing on the details, my drawing started looking more realistic and lifelike, with depth instead of appearing flat. And lastly, another huge benefit of drawings that comes exactly from the reference is that instead of floating facial features, everything will fit naturally within the form. At the beginning, you might think that what am I even doing? Because you are drawing parts bits by bits. But when you take your time and you draw exactly from what you are seeing in the reference photo, right, it will finally come together. At first, I would draw eyes, noses, and lips almost separately without thinking about how they are connected, right? This made them look like they were just placed on the face instead of being part of it. Now, once I started looking at the structure of the face from the reference photo, how the nose flows instead how the nose flows into the cheeks, how the lips curve around the mouth, and how shadows help everything blend together. My portraits started looking much more natural and well balanced. These are just few of the numerous benefits when you start to draw exactly what you see on the reference, right, than what you think it is, you see. But with all this in mind, if you do not want to make the mistakes that I did, right, these are the things that you must definitely avoid so that your drawing wouldn't look flat but three-dimensional. Rule number one, stop guessing instead of truly observing. Now, your brain naturally simplifies details, so don't let it. Now, what do I mean? When we look at something, our brain automatically tries to simplify it to make sense of it faster. This is why you might think you know what an eye, nose, or lips look like. But when you actually try to draw them, something feels off. If you are relying on memory or assumptions, you will end up with a general idea rather than an accurate representation. So instead, take that time to really look at your reference. Study the shapes, angles, and shadows as they actually appear, not how your brain expects them to be. Rule number two, stop drawing symbols instead of real features. An eye isn't just an almond shape, it has depth and structure. When I first started drawing, I would sketch eyes as simple almond shapes, noses as just two curved lines, and lips as basic outlines. But in real life, features, right, don't have bold outlines. They have soft transitions, folds, and light variations that create their shape. A real eye has overlapping eyelids, reflections, tear ducts, and shading that give it depth. Now, instead of thinking of an eye as a symbol, break it down into what you actually see, where the shadows fall, where the highlights hit, and how the eyelids wrap around the eyeball. This shift in mindset will instantly improve realism in your drawings. And finally, rule number three, stop ignoring small details. Tiny changes in light and form make a huge difference in realism. Now, it's easy to focus only on the big shapes in a drawing, but the smallest details are what truly bring it to life. Subtle shadows around the nostrils, a tiny reflection in the eye, or the soft curve of a cheekbone can completely change how realistic a portrait looks. If you overlook these fine details, right, your drawing might feel flat or unfinished. Train yourself to zoom in and notice these small differences. Why? Because they add texture, depth, and believability to your work. So, in conclusion, realism isn't about being perfect on the first try. It's about training your eye, building patience, and refining your skills over time. So if you've been making these mistakes, right, don't worry. I did too. The key is to slow down, observe carefully, and trust the process. And you are not alone in this because I am also learning that too. So keep practicing, keep learning, and most importantly, enjoy the journey of improving your art. You've got this.
You might be wondering, how can you apply this on a real drawing? One of the hardest parts of drawing realism is to get the eyes right. If the eyes feels off, the whole portrait will feel wrong. But don't worry, I've got you covered. Check out this video right here, where I'll be teaching you how to draw the realistic eyes step by step. See you there.